Thank you all for being here. We'd like to welcome you all to Smith's for the book launch, Fabricio Tocco's book launch or novel, Parece diciembre. We'd like to commence by acknowledging that we're gathering on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And without further ado, I would like to just give a little outline as to how we're going to organise this evening's proceedings. To begin with, I just wanted to offer, as the privileged person who Fabricio has invited me to read and launch his novel. You've been doing a bit of a book tour, and the novel has been launched across the world, and we are gathering here in this meeting place to launch it the final time, or
not the final time.
Okay, the penultimate time here in Canberra, the place you call home. I would like to start with some brief remarks on my impressions of the novel, if I can. Then we will go into some questions and answers with the author for you people, some questions that I have thought of. And then we would like to open it up to all of you to ask questions of Fabricio in regards to this novel. When I teach classes in literature, in Spanish studies, I like to start with a very open-ended question. ¿De qué se trata? ¿De qué se trata? Which basically, and some of my students can attest to this, it's a very stupid question in some senses, but there's no stupid questions in my view. And it basically translates to, what's it about? And so I'm going to give you a very brief response to that question in these introductory remarks. Firstly, in a very superficial sense, usually the first response you get to that question is, well, this happens, and then this happens, and then there's this character. But really, we want to get to something slightly deeper, maybe, with this question, and hopefully we can bear that out in the conversation. Essentially, Parece diciembre is a novel told by 6 different narrators who each give us insight and a perspective into a very elusive young novelist called Piero Maimone, who coincidentally has written a novel called Parece diciembre. While many of the conversations take place in the novel's present, they actually cast us back to a very tumultuous time in Argentina's history, the year 2001, the end of 2001, when Argentina was plunged into a rather catastrophic, one might say, financial crisis with devastating consequences for its citizens and beyond. Many had to fight for their survival, and many, in fact, had to find somewhere else to call home as a result. The first part is this very touching conversation between a father and a son as they're preparing a parrilla. The father being Daniel, the son being our main character, Piero Maimone. The second is told by his sister, Chiara, who recounts their memories of childhood in Argentina before their sudden departure to Spain during the tumultuous years of this financial crisis. The third part is by Patricia, Piero's English teacher, who's now completing a PhD and writes a series of letters to him, in which they have some very interesting discussions about politics and identity throughout that. The fourth, a close friend and bandmate called El Russo, recounts their adventures and their escapades as they learnt and grew up together playing music. The fifth is told by an old flame called Liwen and their unsuccessful venture to the south, you might say, of Argentina. And the last is told by Aurora, who is a family maid, and brackets once again the temporal space of the novel, returning to the December of 2001 once more, right as things are kicking off and getting quite dangerous. What do we learn about Piero throughout this time? We learn that his childhood was actually one of constant movement, of uprootedness. Firstly, his family moves from Argentina, where he's born, to Brazil, and then comes back, only to cross the Atlantic while he's finishing school to study university in Spain and to go and to complete a PhD in Canada. Sound familiar? We learn that he is a rather reserved, pensive, intellectual, creative, and loyal young man with an eclectic interest in the arts, from folk music, American rock, Argentinian rock, English literature, Borges, Cortázar, and most especially, tango music. Music imbues every page of this book. I can't wait for the audiobook. We're given the voice of Daniel, the echoes of Russo, Liwen's lyrics, and Aurora's tonada. Anyone who knows Fabricio might ask themselves how it could be any other way. The form of the chapters for me is fascinating. They take the form of monologues, reminiscent of the second part of Roberto Bolaños' The Savage Detectives, to which the novel pays a lot of homage, I feel. Its metafictional and tongue-in-cheek alter ego, Piero, holds many similarities with our very own author here in Flesh and Bones, as I've already mentioned. Perhaps one of the funniest I find of the similarities is the fact that they both suffer from coughing fits, which maybe sounds a bit cruel, but we share offices, we have offices right next to each other, and it's very often that I hear Fabricio coughing his lungs out, and in certain times of the season we're kind of echoing each other because I'm coughing my lungs out as well. Mm-hmm. I think what's fascinating about these monologues, and what I think is truly praiseworthy, are the naturalness of the speech, the integrity of the characters throughout the chapters. They're highly distinct voices. They're really, and as well I would say, equally reminiscent of some of the best writers of dialogue in our Latin American tradition. From Manuel Puig's The Kiss of the Spider Woman to Alberto Fuguet's Pelando a Rosillo. I don't know if you've read it, but it's an extraordinary novel, very much in this vein. But while Arturo Vellano in The Savage Detective goes on a somewhat kind of hyperbolic search for kind of these neo-vanguard poets, the search at the heart of Parece Diciembre is actually quite different and has, to my mind, a lot more heart. So I return to my initial question, ¿de qué se trata? ¿De qué se trata? One might be tempted to call this a global Latin American novel, given its far-reaching localities. Some of the story takes place in Germany, in Spain, in Argentina, in the south of Argentina. Australia doesn't get a mention, but maybe for the sequel. The novel, while in Spanish, has momentary slips or loans from Portuguese, Portuñol, Catalan, English, Iberian Spanish, all inextricably mixed with the characteristic Argentinian Spanish. Che? In turn, infused, of course, with many indigenous words also. This also points us back again, I feel, to the polyglot of an author we have here before us. Parece Diciembre is a novel about identity, about uprootedness, precisely on the question, for me, of the nation. It is a novel wondering whether it is easier to stay or to go. It is a novel hoping that those we left behind in a formative time of our lives might still remember us and remember us as a formative time of their lives. There's a novel about how we access a part of our identity from afar when we are distant from the people, the streets, the sounds that we call home. Its epigraph reflects all of these sentiments as well as captures the heart of so many moments in the novel. Para el millón que se fue, for the million that left. Para las docenas de miles que se volvieron, for the tens of thousands who returned. Para los millones que se quedaron peleándola, for the millions that stayed fighting for it. Para los 39 que perdimos en el camino, for the 39 that we lost along the way. I would suggest that in times of dispersion, of globalization and migration crises, it is a novel in search of a nation, in search of a home. So without further ado, I hope that you would join me in declaring this book officially relaunched in Fabricio's new home. Here. So on to the questions. Now you can finally hear from him. I apologize. There's so many questions I have for you, Fabricio, and I hope that you understood the sense of my enjoyment of the novel. My first question always when I read a piece of a fiction like this is, where did it come from? Where on earth did this novel come from? Where was its beginning, its kind of its first inception? And also, how did you know when it was finished?
Mm-hmm. It came from insomnia. I would say. It's as you pointed out, it's a very autobiographical, personal story. And I guess it came from the need to represent trauma. Someone asked me a similar question in Spain when I launched it. They said, "Why did you write this book?" And I said, "Well, I feel like I couldn't have not written this book." So I think that it comes from a place of existential need of telling a story, a personal story, and that's where it started. I guess it started 20 years ago in Spain, and then we had an on and off relationship for 20 years. Until most recently, I found the Equidistancias, a publishing house that is based in London and Buenos Aires, that publishes exclusively authors who write in Spanish outside of their country of origin, and that country doesn't necessarily have to have another language. And they do so to kind of capture authors who aren't writing in their own cities, and who are not yet perhaps established in their cities where they moved to. And sometimes, in my case, they don't write in the language in the country in which they live. And the final point was decided by the editor. It wasn't decided by me. Because you always have the sense that you write something differently, or it would change, or you would add something new. I'll leave it at that.
I wanted to give you the opportunity to perhaps speak a little bit more about the title of the novel, rather than me giving too much more about the political context. But I wanted to ask, what does this mean for you, Parece diciembre? I can think of many different ways to understand what the depth of the title. But also, maybe you could speak to anybody here who might not be familiar with the history of Argentina, the kind of political backdrop in the context of this novel's plot, right? What's happening in Argentina in 2001, both in a kind of political sense, but also maybe for you personally.
Well, the title, which translates to English as "It Looks Like December," is kind of the first half of a verse of a song, of a bolero, by a Brazilian author who I admire a lot, called Chico Buarque. And the name of the song, of the bolero, is Anos Dourados, which means golden years. So the whole verse reads, "It looks like December of a golden year." And the use of the verse in the title, it's an allusion, as you mentioned before, to the year 2001, to December of 2001, which was and still is, a very vivid month for not only Argentinians, but people in the region, Uruguay, Chile, Brazil even, because it was kind of the culmination of a 5-year recession that Argentina was going through. And to put it very briefly, the headline that the historians or journalists used to like to give about this month, it was the month in which in 11 days or 10 days, there were 5 presidents in power. So it was political turmoil, political crisis, but also followed by an economical crisis, because it was kind of the exit to that 5-year recession, in that people had their savings, their money in their banks, and there had been going on a bank run. People were withdrawing their money and putting it in foreign banks or in their homes. And so the government, to stop that, forbade the people to withdraw more than a certain amount of money in a country where economy is very informal. And it was certainly more than what it is now. And things function with cash more than with debit cards or credit cards. So that meant paralyzing the economy in a way. And then it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. In that people wanted to withdraw the money more, and then the system collapsed. So the banks wouldn't have enough money to give everyone who was going to withdraw their money. And all of this in a context in which some ciphers say half of the population was under line of poverty. and there was 19% of unemployment, and then another bunch of underemployment. So that was the national context. And then the consequence of all of that crisis was that, as the epigraph points out, 1 million Argentines left the country. Here we have Maximo, who's the ambassador of Argentina, who's will be happy to tell you stories about when he was working in Miami back then, and so many Argentinians were moving to Miami or to Barcelona, as was the case of me and my family. I was 16 back then. So it's a story, the novel is a story about how the political invades the personal in a way, and transforms the life of a family that in all this context, my dad was fired from the company which he was working, and not only his savings were kind of confiscated in the bank, but also the payout was confiscated in the bank. So it's a story of that, how do we as a family navigated that crisis.
I wanted to ask about, because I took a particular interest in the way in which, the kind of the how of the novel as well, like how it is that you tell the story. I thought it was fascinating, having these 6 voices, and something that is quite interesting to me always is I guess that for me, I've always understood artworks as a series of choices, right? And so I wanted to ask you about some of the formal choices that you made in the process of writing this. Obviously, you've already pointed to one of them being the choice to make it a rather autofictional novel. I wonder if you could either expand on that, but also I'm also interested, maybe you can connect it on the topic of the monologues, right? Because I found it very interesting. I mean, they are dialogues in a way, right? But what ends up happening in most of these chapters is that we only hear one side of the conversation, or we only hear one side of the email correspondence, or and Piero is noticeably absent, in voiceless, and I wonder whether you could speak to that as a formal kind of choice. And
Yes, well, so yes, I wanted to write an auto-fictional book, but I didn't want to write it in a way that I don't find that interesting, which is basically the author talking about his life in the first person, narrating their story about their own from their own perspective. So I thought it was a bit more interesting to try and imagine how creating characters, basically, how to my own personal story would be told by other people, which is, I guess, more narcissistic than you telling your own story. But I thought it worked. And the idea of the monologue, I thought, well, it's very informed by, as you mentioned before, Manuel Puig, Boquitas Pintadas, Heartbreak Tango, a novel that was published in the 60s and was translated to English very, very soon after. And also by a South African-Australian author who I admire a lot, John Maxwell Coetzee, who lives in Adelaide, and wrote a novel while I was starting to write this novel called Summertime, in which there's a similar structure about a dead author in that case, dead author in that case. So I thought that the idea of the monologue was, I was trying to, I guess, get at the isolation that people feel in their echo chamber about how they understand the nation, how they understand their past, the history of their country, and try to represent that in literature. There's also WhatsApp voice messages that are not responded. So all of that is kind of a homage to, as you mentioned, Bolaño, and as you mentioned, Manuel Puig, and the care for orality of how people speak, and of how migration changed the way people speak. In the first chapter, we have someone who hasn't moved yet to Spain, and then second chapter, we have someone who did. So their Spanish changed, and I'll try to reflect that. Which is a very complicated thing to negotiate, because we all have a set idea of how people speak in different accents, in different varieties of our language. So it's very hard to convince that that is plausible, that a person speaking sounds like a Spanish person or sounds like an Argentinian person. Especially in the writing, and not
taking advantage of the audible, right, as well.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, that's right.
Because so much of those specificities is also carried in tone. We talk about the Argentinian canto, and, but also in pronunciation, also, right? I did want to talk about the emails and the WhatsApps because I wanted to ask you again about this question of that decision, right? So was that related in some way to the discussion around kind of changing technologies with recording and things like that as well? Because obviously on the cover we see a series of different kind of music players, a record player, cassette, a disc, and we also have at one point in the story, I think it's Russo and Piero are kind of like raiding the basement and finding kind of this tocadiscos, and so like I wonder, is that part of your interest as well in your writing, also to consider the evolution and the ways in which those technologies mediate our communication?
Yeah, and how they mediate, and also how they perpetuate or reproduce all forms of communication. The emails are more like letters. In fact, the chapter is called "The Letters." Of Patricia, not the emails of Patricia, and the WhatsApp messages are not that different from cassettes that my parents would record to each other while they were in Argentina and Brazil and send them via post. So, yeah, I guess I wanted to look at how technology mediates language as much as migration mediates language. And it was also a way of going back to the monologue through different lens, so that not all the chapters were monologues that seemed like dialogues. So someone sending a voice message on WhatsApp, which is perhaps to you sounds a bit strange, but I think in Hispanic countries, particularly in Argentina, is super common to communicate on a daily basis. Yeah.
Wasn't it an Argentinian that broke the WhatsApp servers for sending a 24-hour audio
There's a
message?
hoax. There's a hoax about that. Yes.
Was it a hoax or?
No, it's just a joke by a Spanish newspaper.
Oh,
but
okay.
yeah.
Right. I thought it was real. Fake news.
Very plausible. Very plausible.
It's very plausible. Well, I've heard your messages. I wanted to ask you about some of the musicality of the novel. Obviously, there's this kind of fascination. Obviously, like you said, there's a certain element of obsession in a lot of these characters about this figure of Piero. Some of them are old friends, remembering, oh, this guy's published a novel, I wonder if I'm in it. It's their own narcissism as well, in some senses. But one part of his character that everyone finds kind of quite elusive is his obsession with tango. And particularly his bandmate Russo, who he's been playing, rock music with and wanting to play Red Hot Chili Peppers at concerts and things like that, is kind of quite taken aback by this. Why tango? Why tango music? And why do you think that, how could you speak to the way in which that functions as an important musical genre for Piero and his identity, and what impact has tango had in your own life?
Well, there's something very interesting about tango lyrics from the 30s and the 40s, which struck me back then, while my family was deciding to migrate to Europe, is that they all talk about migration, but they talk about leaving Argentina at a time when that was not common, when it was more that people would go to Argentina. So the tango lyrics were perhaps talking about Italians, Jews, Spanish people who were migrated to Argentina, and talking about uprooting, but they kind of resonated with the new situation in which Argentines that had been that until then a country that would receive migrants was becoming, much like other countries in Latin America, a country that would expel people, that would have migrants who would leave Argentina. That on the lyric side, then on the search of identity, I think, is not just about tango, but the book cover has the cover of a famous, recognizable rock record from the 80s called Giros, which translates as, I guess, turning points. which is it's a very interesting record because it's rock music, but also has tango solos with synthesizer from the 80s and stuff like that. And I wanted to talk about the transformative power of music at a time, the 90s, in which at least the music that was listened to wasn't tango, was rock in English that came from the US or from England, Britpop, rock music, and that kind of coincided with a time in which we had our own currency, but our currency was pegged to the dollar, and people were traveling to the US, and it was a time when identity was kind of, I should say, downplayed or downgraded, national identity. And at that time, the kind of turning point, the heat of the return to the past, kind of has, of course, a conservative, nostalgic flair, but also has a correlation in things that happen outside of my own story to a lot of Argentinians who, after having migrated to Spain in particular, but Europe in general, realized that they were Latin Americans and that their identity was important, that they weren't Americans as they thought they were. And also that had a correlation in political movements in the region in the 2000s of politicians who tried to go back to a more regional approach, a more not necessarily nationalistic, but a more regional approach to the country.
I think it's one of the central things that touched me, I guess, of the novel. Also, somebody who migrated at a young age from a Hispanic country, leaving Chile at a young age, coming to Australia. That question of like, how do we create those links with that part of our identity that we don't want to just be about the past, we want to bring it into the present. And there's this whole beautiful exchange between, it's kind of an imaginary exchange between Russo and Piero about exactly that question. There's like, is that a legitimate form of access and to the nation, or is it kind of nostalgic reminiscences, but nevertheless, I think it was just such a beautiful, deep, conversation there that's happening. I wanted to jump or zoom out a touch and ask a question about perhaps your apprehensions about writing. I mean, I think that I get asked this question all the time as somebody who works with literature. When are you writing anything? And they don't mean academic writing. They mean like, are you writing anything interesting, like a novel or something like that? And I always say that I'm too afraid. And there is that old kind of saying that, like, the critic is a coward or a failed writer because they're too afraid to actually build. They're just there to criticize. And I know you're not a literary critic. You're an academic. Often people conflate the two, but I do wonder whether there was something in your training in literature and in your academic, in your studies and in becoming an academic, did that give you any apprehensions about writing creatively, given you spend so much time reading and writing about fiction?
Clearly not.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I suppose it can have a paralyzing effect. Reading too much, as it had to Don Quixote, right?
Yeah.
But I think that it can also be enabling, and it can help you see things with different eyes. And if you enjoy so much reading, why wouldn't you also write it? No, write fiction. I think that it's kind of a topic, not a topic. How do you say it? Like a commonplace to say that critics or academics don't write fiction, and I think that it's more common than we think.
I'm going to open it up for questions soon, so you all have the opportunity to ask your own questions of Fabricio. But I have a couple more questions before I finish up. For those of you who don't know, Fabricio, in his academic research, has written a couple of books now on detective fictions in Latin America. The first one, Latin American Detectives Against Power, which was published by Lexington, And recently, the one that's going to come out at the end of this year is called Precarious Secrets, A History of the Latin American Thriller. Is that
Political
correct?
thriller.
Political thriller, with the University of Texas Press. I was probably a fool picking up this novel, thinking that it might be a detective story.
You're not the first one.
Yeah, okay. But I wanted to ask, not, why not? Why isn't it a detective story? I wanted a detective story. But I wanted to ask whether you could comment on what kind of relationship you see between your intellectual research, your work that you do in the academy, and your research, your scholarship, and this novel. Is there some sort of precarious secret waiting to emerge out of this novel?
Well, I think that what they have in common, this is a Bildungsroman, right? It's a coming-of-age story, autobiographical, more, I would say, traditional literary style. It's not necessarily genre fiction, but what they do have in common is that genre fiction, at least in Argentina, is not cheap literature. It's not. It is popular, but it's not what we understand, perhaps, in Anglophone countries as crime fiction, right? So, for me, writing about political events and writing about how the political affects the personal is not that different in that sense to write fiction about it and to write criticism about it, because they're very connected, at least in Argentine literary tradition. But having said this, I do have a crime fiction novel coming up. So then that question won't feature in next book launches.
Okay, right. Yeah, I was going to ask you whether, because just before we talk about your future crime fiction novel, I just think that I was thinking in particular in reflecting upon the last section of Parece, diciembre, in which you return to, I guess, December 2001 when Piero is about to leave, and he has this final parting conversation with his maid, with the family maid, and I couldn't help but think of an article you've written about Roma, Alfonso Cuarón's Roma, and how that film became quite had a lot of fascinating commentary around the fact that the protagonist says nothing throughout the whole film. And yet here it's kind of quite the opposite. The protagonist actually says nothing, but the maid is given a lot of space to kind of speak about her experience and what she's going to face. Is there anything you wanted to kind of say about that?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, in that film, Roma, also the kids don't speak either, right? There's not much dialogue in general.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I haven't thought about relationship.
Well, that's my job, maybe. I don't know. Connecting your work. But anyway, I just thought that was an interesting connection that maybe you had responded in some way to kind of this discussion, even though not in an overt way. Okay, fantastic. Please, our lovely audience, I'm grateful so much for your presence here, and I'm sure Fabricio is as well. Do we have any questions? I see a hand raised here. Julianne, please.
Thanks so much, both. That was so interesting, and it was interesting to hear that Australia is in your novel in the form of J.M. Petzer. And I was wondering whether you attempted to go full autofictional and name your protagonist after yourself.
Oh no! I dared to send a copy of the novel to him.
Oh, did you?
Yes, and he has currently a copy. So that's what I've dared to done. But no, the main character, my alter ego in the novel, is not named after me. No, but it's more in the tradition of Argentine literature, in which the name of the character and the last name of the character are named after other people in my family. The last name Maimone comes from Hebrew, and it's a very rare Italian last name that means ghost. So I wanted to, make an allusion to the fact that the character doesn't speak, and it's like a ghostly presence in the story.
Well, first of all, congratulate Fabricio on this novel, but congratulate you both because this presentation has really wanted to make me want to read the novel. So I thought it was very, very well presented. I was wondering, do you get deeply into the political reasons of why the crisis happened, or what kind of analysis or
Yeah, I do, but because the characters narrate their own perspective of the story, there isn't kind of a one way to read it, right? So the father is very apologetic of the whole 90s status quo, whereas the girlfriend is more like coming from a leftist perspective. And so going back to what I mentioned before about the echo chamber, I tried, I'm not sure if I succeeded, but I tried to give this idea that there's not a definite version of what happened, and that is trying to represent the current debates in Argentina nowadays. Our current president is kind of the product of a nostalgia from the 90s, and millions of people voted for him. So clearly there isn't a definite narration of what happened, and I was trying to represent that plural, ongoing, discussion. I think I answered the question. There is, of course, the irony that I mentioned at the beginning that it looks like December of a golden year. No one remembers a year in which 5 presidents governed the country in a week as a golden year. So there is an irony there, in that the people who defend that kind of regime truly believe that they were golden years and that they're nostalgic about it. So so there is kind of I'm taking a position, but I'm trying not to make it into testimony about what happened.
Sorry, and another brief comment. I think that taking it up, having a content of music involved in this, I think is very interesting, because especially when you've gone to live overseas, music is at least for us. I think you might feel it. Tango and music in general is something very nostalgic that takes you back constantly to where you're from, and I think that's a very interesting approach as well to connect it with music. So I'm very looking forward to reading.
Thank you. Well, there's copies if anyone is interested, of course. Well, yes, it's nostalgic, but at the same time, I think it is connected to the present and to how you position yourself as a migrant, because something that very famously Chilean poet Vicente Huidobro said, that he realized he was Chilean when he moved to Paris to study literature at Sorbonne. So in Chile, he was just a writer or just a student. He wasn't a Chilean, right? So you kind of become that. You become your nation while you're living overseas. While in your country, you weren't your nation, right? So you kind of personify that place where you come from. And I think that music and literature and culture in general, I think, has that transformative power of reminding you who you are, and not necessarily defining who you are, but helping you remember, what you are in a context of dynamism, I guess,
You've been talking a lot about autobiography and the real parts of your story, but there's also a fiction side.
For sure.
So how did you go about fictionalizing parts of it? How were some areas easier for you to just make up, or how did you go about that?
Well, I think that everything is fiction. Even if, no, I mean in the novel, let's not go to discussion of, I said no. I mean that even if you're representing your own father or your own sister or yourself, you do so with small morsels of what you think these people are, and your own memories were not necessarily entirely fictional, but they are stories that we tell ourselves, and they're not necessarily the same as life, right? So even when you stick to the facts, stick to the biography, you're fictionalizing. The parts that are more fictional, I think, had to do with parts in which the publisher wasn't really convinced that some things were plausible. So, for instance, I personally, me as a person, had this connection with tango and with music that wasn't perhaps listened to in my house when I was little, back when my family decided to leave Argentina and move to Spain. And the publisher would say, oh, this is not plausible. Like tango is something that a 40-year-old, a 50-year-old listened to. Especially back then, no one was listening to tango. You have to migrate first to listen to tango. And I had to create kind of a narrative that would make that plausible. And I found that connecting it through the history of Argentinian rock, that is very different from British rock because it's very connected to tango, which was much more plausible for a teenager to be listening to in the 1990s. So that's an example. Yeah.
I love very much that you were also able to integrate that precise kind of critique into the novel as well, because some of the characters are also saying the exact same sort of thing, saying, but that's the music of our grandparents, like what the hell? And so it's sort of like you're, I don't know if that was written before the editor had made that comment, but I would like very much to see the editor kind of maybe smile to themselves at seeing their own words reflected back to them, you know, including with that tint of prejudice. Any further questions, please? Ash.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just interested in the question of identity and the connection with multilingualism in the novel. You've spoken about migration and just then about how you really discover your kind of national identity and going to another country, which I think all of us who have travelled has experienced that. But I'm kind of interested in whether you see this as, I mean, it's written in Spanish, but there are other languages in there. Do you see it then as an Argentinian novel? Do you see it, or do you see it more wanting to kind of straddle multiple identities, or somehow move between, or question that notion of a fixed identity?
That's a great question. No fixed identities, of course. The other languages, there's almost one language per chapter that is kind of interfering, being noisy with the Spanish. So there's Portuguese in the first chapter, there's Catalan and German in the second chapter, there's English in the third chapter, and then there's Quechua, an indigenous language, the Maids language in the last chapter. And all of these are reminding us that all of what I was mentioning before, this seek for identity doesn't necessarily have to be something nostalgic, something conservative, something reactionary. It can also be inclusive and integrate other identities. And I think that that's what migration is. Because we sometimes think about migration in negative terms, as we lose our country or we lose our language. But I think that we could also think about it as something that multiplies your identity. You gain new languages or you gain new perspectives to the places you go to live. And that's what I was trying to reflect with all these noises, interferences. What if it's an Argentinian novel or not? I don't know. It's very hard to call it an Argentinian novel because I wrote part of it in Argentina, but I wrote it in many different places. And it's set in different places. It is written in Spanish, but there's a lot of Spanish from Spain there. Again, there's lots of Catalan as well. So I hope that one critic one day says I'm trying to destabilize what that is, but that's what I'm aiming for. I hope I answered your question.
Since you migrated as a family, what do they think about your novel?
Interesting question. I wrote a first draft of this novel and gave it to them for them to read it a few years ago. And it was quite interesting that the reactions that I was expecting didn't happen. I was expecting people to get mad because, they thought they were negatively portrayed or things like that. But it was more people who thought that they weren't portrayed enough or that they weren't portrayed as they thought. So in rewriting the last draft, I guess, of the novel, I kind of took that into consideration because I thought it was interesting, the social aspect of literature, the social aspect that authors encounter. And there's I think, they're kind of trying to, a criticism of authors like Bolaño, for instance, who love to include in their novels characters who love to read and who love literature. And I was trying to be a bit more realistic and try to represent how people feel about literature, sometimes in very personal ways, as Thomas said, very narcissistic ways. that are very different from the ways we understand it as like scholars or readers or writers. Yeah. You're welcome.
Yeah, there's one character in particular who just wants to scan the novel to see whether he appears in it or not. So yeah, very funny, very funny.
I'm interested in your use of the tango as a motif and how that intensity of the dance is explored through the characters or some other part of the narrative.
Yeah, so the dance is not so much explored. It's more the music and the lyrics independently from the dance. I know that tango has a very strong connection with the dance. I would say especially outside of Argentina. In Argentina, ever since the 60s, 70s, because of different composers who started writing tango to be listened to, not to be danced to, the music started to become kind of independent from the dance, although perhaps there is some element of the dance revealed at the end of the novel, which I'm not going to spoil. Yes, I would say that.
Is there anybody, any people or any you'd like to thank in this last kind of parting words? I'm not inviting you to thank me, by the way. I'm inviting you to thank the people who were part of the story in the novel.
Thank you. Now, of course, I'd like to thank you for reading the novel so dedicatedly, so devotedly, and for your kind words, and for putting time. I know you have 3 sick children waiting at home, so I appreciate you being here. I appreciate all of you being here. Most of you perhaps don't even know Spanish, so I'm very happy that you're here listening about a novel written in Spanish. Hopefully, it will be translated to English one day. We'll see. And I'd like to thank Enrique Satara and Andres Taxir, my editors, my publishers in London and Buenos Aires, and all the people who are already thanked for in the novel. So, yeah, and thank you so much.
Thank you.